Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've been enjoying the campus offerings for our first ever virtual homecoming. My name is Corey Cunningham, and I'm a graduate of the Evening and Weekend MBA program, and actually just graduated this past spring in 2020, so in the midst of our virtual world. And I also serve as the co-chair for the Berkeley Haas Alumni Council in our alumni community. And we're thrilled today to have Ming here today to speak to you about the neuroscience of consumer choice and its relation to brand valuation. At the conclusion of this talk, we will have some time to address your questions. Please be sure there's a YouTube chat. As your questions come up, please use that to put your questions into Ming. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ming Xu. Ming is an associate professor and William Halford Jr. Family Chair in Marketing at the Haas School of Business. He also holds an appointment at the Helen Wills Neuroscience Institute. His research involves using neuroscientific and computational tools to understand the biological basis of economic and consumer decision-making. So Ming joined us in 2009, and prior to that, he was an assistant professor of economics and neuroscience at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Ming, the time is yours, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Corey. And thanks for having me for this event. I'm really excited to share my work with all of you. So let me start with, let me just start with the talk. So I'll be talking about how we're going to use neuroscience and computational techniques, as Corey just mentioned, in understanding kind of this something that all of us, I think, intuitively understand in terms that brands have value, but trying to flesh that out and try to quantify that, understand this at a more scientific level by going into the mind of the consumer, which is really kind of all of us. So let me just start with kind of some of the big pictures here in terms of, I know all of you, you guys come from very different backgrounds, have very different interests. So something I think that impacts every one of us in the modern economy is this idea that firms or companies or any organization really impacts our behavior by sort of changing our minds in some way. Okay, so firms take changes, offers different products, promote differently. What they're trying to do is get us to remember something, get us to like something, and ultimately that translates to hopefully into sales or profits or just attention. So in terms of what you can think of in the past 10 years or so, in terms of what people oftentimes call it kind of the analytics revolution or big data revolution, a lot of that has been at the level of improving the measurement of consumer behavior. So now I don't need to tell any of you this, but every time we go on Facebook, every time we go on Google, every time we buy anything from Amazon, the companies track something about what we do, what we look at, how we respond. So that has allowed companies, governments, organizations to gain a lot of insight into how people respond to the actions that those organizations are taking, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And we might have some time to talk about the ethics of these as well. But for the purposes of this particular talk, what I want to focus on instead is the middle ground, that unlike something like clicks or purchases, it's been much more challenging to measure something that I think as consumers, all of us take for granted, instinctively, that we pay attention to certain things, that we remember certain things, that we relate to certain people better than others. Those are things that are, ubiquitous. But at the same time, it has been much, much harder to measure. So what we're going to try to do, and what a lot of the research, at least the applied side of what my lab does, is to try to develop these techniques to understand how, for example, memory, how, for example, attention affects decision-making, and how do we translate that into insights that companies can use, but also that governments and policymakers can use to provide more rational and better regulation of what companies and what firms do, right? So kind of backing up and telling you a little bit about myself and about my lab, because this is definitely a collaborative endeavor. No one person can do all the different things that I'll be talking about. So as Corey mentioned, I'm the William J. Halford Family Chair of Marketing. I've been at TOS since 2009. I received my PhD from Caltech in 2006. At Berkeley, I direct the neuroeconomics lab, and you see a picture of some of us, at least, I think this was one of the going away parties for a couple of members who either graduated or who went on to have faculty jobs. And so what our group does is, I like to think of as having a couple of hats, or sometimes more than a couple of hats. One of them is to understand kind of the basic science component. Okay, so this is the aspect that is, where we are much more like neuroscientists, biologists, economists, trying to understand the basic principles of how people make decisions, whether it's buying something on Amazon, or whether it's saving for retirement, or even who to marry, and kind of momentous decisions like this, like that. And what we also try to do, and I think one of the aspects that is unique to, or that is not necessarily unique, but special at least to being in a business school, is that we also spend a lot of time in thinking about how we translate this basic science to ways that that what I mentioned earlier, firms and regulators and consumers can use those basic insights for practical ends. Okay, so in this talk, I'll be talking more about the latter part, but I'll also hopefully make an impression on you that what we were able to do in the second part in terms of application depends critically on what we've learned in the basic science. So very much as when we're building a nuclear power plant, there's you're basing this on decades of research in basic sciences. We're not doing anything so world changing, but at the same time, it also builds on kind of these more basic knowledge. So hopefully that'll be clear in the talk. So just to give you a little bit of sense of when I wear my basic science hat, when our lab works on basic science problems, these are, we oftentimes are very kind of brain centric, in the sense that we try to understand, how does a brain perform a particular task? So for example, how does the brain encode and respond to kind of notions of distributive justice, to notions of fairness? How do our genes regulate our responses to and allow us to compete strategically, whether if we give certain types of pharmacological agents, can we change people's preferences? What brain damage can do to various aspects of behavior. In this example, we're studying honesty. So how brain damage, or whether certain parts of the brain is necessary for people to be honest or to satisfy their self-interest, right? So these are kind of much more basic science questions that hopefully you'll see kind of the link with what I'll be talking about for the most part in this talk, which is when we're wearing our marketing hat or more applied hat, in terms of translating kind of these ideas to understand how, when companies interact with consumers, they are, it's kind of going through sort of the black box of the mind of the consumer, right? And the whole premise of a lot of what we do is that by opening up this black box, we have a better sense, or we can predict better or serve consumers better by understanding what's going on in their mind. Okay. And for this particular project, I just like to mention and give a shout out to the team, especially Zhihao Zhang, who did I think, the lion's share of work, who's a postdoc in the lab. Also Andy Kaiser, who's at UCSF and our collaborator on this project. And also our wonderful team of Max Good, Sienna, and Peter, who were undergrads when they started and who contributed a lot to this project. So, okay, so this is, so let me kind of talk about a little bit about the basic concept that is underpinning all of this research, which is the idea, I think, that is going to be very intuitive and accessible to everybody in the audience. And it's just the idea of being top of mind, that there's some things that are on the top of your mind. If I ask you about, pick a university, I hope most of you, when you think, well, when I ask you this question, you'll say UC Berkeley, right? So it's the idea that certain things in our mind are more accessible to us than others, right? We may know Stanford exists, but it may not be top of your mind, or maybe it is, right? And it doesn't necessarily say anything about it. It sometimes can't, but it doesn't necessarily reflect how much you even like it, right? And all of those things have really profound impact on marketing, on businesses. So this is, I think, something that all of you can relate to. This is a study back in 1991 in the, seems like might as well be 100 years ago these days. This was a study where the authors asked a single respondent to come up with all of the beverages that they can think of. Okay. And this is something that this person does, and I think we can relate to it very easily, which is, I think, why this figure is very sort of accessible. We're not looking at something we don't understand. This person's first says Coke and Pepsi. He goes through a bunch of other soft drinks. He runs out of soft drinks. He switches to beer. He runs out of beer, and then he sort of switches back to soft drink. Right? So I think all of us can sort of relate to this. This is something that is very human and very intuitively human, but it's something that machines, that even the best AI systems these days are not able to predict very well what's in the mind of people when you ask them for, what's on your mind when I say X, right? And so some of our research also has implications for kind of developing better computational models of these type of processes. But coming back to the marketing, this is something that there are many, many books. These are just two of the examples that from a quick search on Amazon that I found. But there are many books, and this has been something that I think marketers from very early days in its inception, marketers intuitively understand the value of being top of mind. So a lot of the brand building exercises, a lot of promotion activity traditionally has been to make sure that, for example, McDonald's in the top of your mind, right? Coca-Cola is in the top of your mind. They probably don't have to advertise it. All of us will still remember them for certainly the next year, next 2 years, maybe not the next 10 years. And I'll come back to that again later. But this type of notion that being top of mind is important has been increasingly become challenged. Not that people don't say it's important, but the importance has become harder to, the relative importance of them, of being kind of top of mind. A lot of other traditional marketing notions has been under threat from what I mentioned at the beginning relating to the analytics revolution in terms of measurables, right? So and I think this is something that should resonate with beyond marketing, that we all kind of understand that what we measure is only a very small slice of the big picture, whether it's governments, whether it's businesses. And what I think the challenge today is, given all this amazing data when it comes to, say, not just market performance, but also the economy, it's increasingly harder to justify spending on kind of these softer metrics like top of mind, like happiness even, where it is, fuzzier and softer, and where we don't have hard metrics to quantify it. And as a manager or a policymaker, it becomes really hard to justify spending something on something that is less measurable than spending on something where the returns are more tangible. So this has been kind of an ongoing struggle, and I think a much larger class of problems than just top of mind. But within this one particular problem, the two main challenges, at least as we saw it, is on the one hand, how do we determine whether something, for example, how much is being top of mind even worth, right? And then how do we translate that idea, that number, into manager relevance? How do we show that it's actually manager relevant? Okay. So what is top of mind, and what are its contributions to brand equity, and how do we connect it to key performance indicators like revenue, profits, but also, customer satisfaction, and others, and customer loyalty, and also something that that marketers, I think, traditional marketers have speculated for a long time, that traditional measures of brand equity that traditional measures of brand equity tremendously underestimate the actual value of brand equity. So there's sort of like a dark matter of brand equity that is being neglected using our current instruments. So what I'm going to promise to deliver on in this talk is a couple of things. One is just what is giving you an answer about what the worth is of being top of mind. We're going to leverage what we know about human cognition, and we're going to model and measure the effect on choice. And second, we're going to link that to revenue. And we're going to show that, hopefully at least show you a partial picture of why we think that brand equity, at least in some cases, is being dramatically underestimated. Okay? So if this is not a topic that you spend a lot of time thinking about, and I think for most of you, most of you probably don't wake up in the morning thinking about, brand equity or marketing. This is, I think, an intuitive way of understanding what's missing and why it's important. So if you think about most ways of measuring consumer value, what consumers care about, this is kind of a picture of a figure of kind of typical economic experiments or marketing experiments where we present people different options. So we present them option X and option Y, and you're asked to choose between them. This is kind of more of personal finance decision where you're asked to, whether you want to choose between A and B that returns kind of different amounts. Okay. And what they have in common is that the choices that customers are presented with comes with all the information that's necessary for you to make a choice. Okay. So if you think about going to a restaurant, this is where the restaurant makes your job as easy as possible by giving you a menu. Everything is described, and you're just asked to choose between what's on the menu. Now, in the real world, lots of things are missing. So what we're going to concentrate is on this one aspect where there's clearly some dependence on memory, and where the consumers have to come up with the options themselves. Okay. So if you think about the traditional ways of asking marketing questions or measuring brand equity as being on the left-hand side, where I just ask you, do you like apples or do you like oranges? You're just choosing between the two. Versus in the real world, what consumers have to do is, in addition to telling you how much they like something, they often have to come up with, what fruit do you, for example, want to buy in the first place, right? And back in the day when we still had workplace lunches, what do you want to have for lunch is a famously difficult question, because you had to come up with the options and everyone has to agree on them, right? So in the real world, what oftentimes you have to do is you have to come up with the options and structure the problem yourself. Okay. And when we talk about brand equity, the traditional way of thinking about this has been about, what is the, once you have everything, what is the value of the brand on top of? And certainly there is some value, but it neglects the crucial way that other influences of brands on consumers' behavior. And this is, so I'm highlighting the role of memory, but attention, emotion, etc. All of those things where all of those factors that very intuitively as consumers we know makes a big difference, right? But the challenge has been, well, how big of a difference over, say, the whole market, right? So what we're going to try to do and is kind of very quickly, let me just kind of go through the type of studies that we first start with laboratory-based studies, and then we are going to generalize them to the marketplace. Okay, so the first set of studies, and this is again going to be very intuitive, and I think the findings for most of you, you don't have to have any specialty in marketing or decision sciences to appreciate what I'm about to say. So if you ask 100 people, actually we asked almost 1,500 people, but if you say, let's say you ask 100 people to do the choice on the left, choose your favorite fruit, right? And then I give you a big menu, and I say to another 100 people, and say, choose your favorite fruit from this menu, right? On the right or on the left, you might say, apple, because you couldn't think of anything else. So apple, oranges. I like apple better. And on the right-hand side, you might think like, oh, guava. I like guava better than apple, but I forget about guava, right? So I'm going to choose guava. That's basically the intuition that we are going to show, that A, it exists and it influences decision making, and 2, it's actually very predictable. Okay, so let me first go to a example that we gave in our experiments. This is one of the categories. So this is fast food. And on the y-axis is the difference between when people have a menu or when people don't have a menu and when people have a menu. Okay, so positive numbers basically mean that people chose McDonald's more when they had to rely on their memory to come up with McDonald's. And negative means when they are hurt, when they had to rely on the memory. So for example, Chick-fil-A and In-N-Out are penalized when they're not on a menu, right? So this is, I think, is something that's very intuitive for humans, for actual humans, that people might say McDonald's just because they couldn't think of In-N-Out. We're in California, and I think most people would say, yeah, In-N-Out's a better burger than McDonald's, right? But if you can't think of In-N-Out in the first place, well, you're not going to choose it. So that's exactly the intuition that we are capturing. And it might surprise you that this is not in any economic model of how people make choices. Because if you're rational, you aren't going to forget things, right? Like, why would you forget In-N-Out exists if you are rational and don't have any constraints on your cognitive processing? So the fact that people are showing a difference between these two is already telling us that there's something quite different from how people actually behave, and how we traditionally have thought of them as behaving. And one thing I just note is on the y-axis, if you note that these are really large numbers. So 15%, so these are proportions. So 15% of McDonald's. So McDonald's only has a 30% market share. It's a big market share in when people don't have a menu. But half of that is coming from the fact that people couldn't think of their competitors when they're making this choice. So that's a big deal, right? And now we can also talk about this with running shoes. So this is another category that we give to people. And you can see that Nike benefits tremendously, 20% almost, from being top of mind, right? And the ones that are hurt by not being top of mind are brands like New Balance, Skechers, Converse, etc. Right? Not Adidas. Adidas is kind of washes out because Adidas is pretty high up. Okay, so now I'm going to talk pretty briefly about the role of the scientific foundation for this. I'm just going to give you enough of the sketch for you to understand how we came about this. Okay. So the general idea, and this kind of goes back decades. The general idea is that memory and preferences are kind of distinct neural systems. Okay, they're distinct cognitive systems such that we can retrieve things without needing to engage the valuation aspects, and we can value things without having to retrieve from memory. So and that the two interact. Okay, the two interact in a fundamental way that we're going to try to take advantage of. And this goes back decades. People have been speculating. Okay, so our addition to this is basically in terms of models of from cognitive neuroscience of how to capture these components, and also to capture their interaction. Okay, so we're going to first capture how likely is it that people generate you can think of as their own internal menu. Okay, so if I say fast food, you come up with McDonald's, Burger King, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's a probabilistic process that we can predict, that's predictable, and also your preferences that we can also capture using traditional methods. And then what we need to do is just multiply these two things together. I mean, it's almost, I think it's so incredibly simple, but it is a very, very strong assumption about how the brain works. Okay. And I think the success of what you see later is really from being able to having a confidence that the brain really works like this, and this is really how the underlying process in terms of memory and preferences work, that we can put them together and expect to get very accurate predictions. Okay, so first, what we're going to try to capture, and for those of you who know about human memory, what we're going to capture is this notion of semantic memory, that are about kind of facts and figures about the real world. Okay, so this is traditionally conceptualized as a associative network. So this goes back to 60s and 70s, where I say like, what comes to mind if I say red? Okay, and some people say fire, people say orange, apples, etc. Right, and you can kind of see this web of connections that is going on in the human mind. And what we're going to do is very much take these type of standard tasks. Some of you might know this from loved ones or from patients that you interact with if you're a physician, in terms of characterizing Alzheimer's disease. So this is a tool that also is used in neurology, where we ask people to come up with, say, as many items as possible from a category. In neurology, typically they use animals. Here we're going to use fruits, fast food, etc. And we're going to sort of build up this semantic network of consumers by looking at these questions. Okay, and and the way that we're going to capture this, I'm going to skip some of the details and the math, but we're going to capture this as a as consumer recall, so you can sort of think of as a random walk on a semantic network, that all of us have this network in our minds, and we're just kind of traversing this this network in you can almost think of it in a physical way. Okay. So this is on the left. What I'm going to first show you is kind of the real data, the human data with recall for running shoes. So 75% people call Nike. So Nike is literally top of mind, and it's incredibly strong. Adidas is second, and then you have third and fourth tiers. Okay, and on the right is kind of the semantic network that we can estimate, we can recover from their responses. It's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to just break it down for you really quickly. So you can sort of think of it when people start. If I say running shoes, they overwhelmingly go to Nike first, right? So from starting state, they go to Nike. The thickness of the lines are in log units. Otherwise, you basically can only see Nike. And when they end, so the last item is typically not Nike unless they're really lazy or they just can't think of, or they know nothing about shoes, right? So the last item they recall is much more likely to be Puma, New Balance, Adidas, Reebok, etc. Okay. So Nike is first. And when people reach Brooks, I didn't even know Brooks was a running shoe when I started this project. But basically, when you reach Brooks, that's it, right? There's not a single person who went on from Brooks to another brand. When you reach Brooks, you say, I run out of things to remember. Okay. So what we're basically going to capture this is using a first order Markov process, which I won't get into, but what's important that we can recover, this is out of sample predictions of people's recall in a very accurate way. Okay. So consumers in the US have a very stable and very have a more or less a common kind of memory structure that we can leverage. Okay. And then we can use the same tool. So this is kind of the traditional marketing way of measuring brand preference, is just to estimate it from their preferences. Okay. And what you can see here is I'm showing this to kind of show the different market structure. And this is important for those of you who are interested in business and marketing, where, for fast food, you have a fairly weak market leader in McDonald's, whereas with running shoes, you have comparatively much stronger category leader in Nike. And that actually has impact for how top of mind plays, the role of top of mind plays in consumer choice. Okay. So what we're going to do is basically we're going to have 3 samples of people. One sample is, or 2 samples I already talked about. And the third one is the open-ended problem with, if I ask you to, choose a fruit or fast food or running shoes, what you would choose. So we're going to use our models from the 2 other samples to predict out of sample what choices that people are going to make when they had to make these open-ended questions. So if you only use preferences, so this is kind of the standard consumer model, a standard way of measuring brand equity. And what you see is that the model tremendously underestimate how often people choose McDonald's, right? And that's the 30% market share that I mentioned to you earlier, where 30% people choose McDonald's, but when we use the choice data, when people have a menu to predict it, we only show that we can only predict that they choose it 15% of the time. Okay? So it's not particularly good. If we only use memory, it's a lot better. Okay. The R squared, or the fit, we are able to explain 80% of the variance. If we put them together, if we simply multiply these things together in a way that in the model, it's a little bit more complicated than multiplying them together, but for the benefit of, for simplicity, just imagine that. We get something that is so accurate that my first reaction was, we clearly did something wrong. This, nothing in consumer behavior is ever, we can ever get to something near 100% accuracy. We went through a bunch of times and we did the study, and and it's basically correct. And if you look at shoes, it's actually even better. It's 99%. I mean, that's just I've been doing this, not for decades, but I've been doing this for like a decade and a half, and I've never seen anything like this in my research, certainly. And if you look across many different categories, so on the right, on the left is the two categories I just showed you. On the right are other categories like fish, green vegetables, salad dressing, fruits, etc. And you can see that in all cases, on the y-axis is the performance of our model, the new model, and on the x-axis are the 2 competing models. And one fun thing is, this also gives you a lot of sense for sustainability and other types of more kind of pro-social aspects, not just in terms of marketing and our traditional kind of business, but also, for example, fish. I particularly like the example of fish because Americans basically only know salmon. So, and they you think they know tuna, but not really. This is average Americans. So in terms of the diet, in terms of, Americans only eat a very small selection of seafood, and we're sort of loving our seafood to death. And one of the reasons, like, well, we actually don't know, we just don't know that many types of fish. Right? So this gives a sense of how consumer education, et cetera, also bring insights there. So this is for those of you who are interested. I'm just going to leave the slide up for 1 second to for the different types of models. If any of you are interested, I'd be happy to talk with you offline. So now let me, in the last 5 minutes or so, get to the managerial relevance. So everything I've showed you so far has been in the laboratory. Okay, so I show you that we're able to make amazing predictions in the laboratory. Now, how does that actually translate into real world measures? Okay, because lots of things work in the lab and they stop working in the real world. Science is hard, right? What can I say? So one of the indications, and there's a few more which I won't have time to get into, but one of I think the most compelling data points that we have is just look at the actual sales. Okay, just looking at the actual sales of, say, fast food. This is 2018 data, and this is the most successful restaurant in sales in dollars. And what we can use is our model. So this is a traditional model of fast food preference to predict their sales. And you can see it's not a very good prediction, right? I mean, it's not terrible. It's actually pretty. I should say it is very good, right? All things considered, it is quite good. If you have nothing else, you will be quite happy with using this as a metric, right? This is why companies use them. But now, if we put the two measures, if we use the new conceptualization where we incorporate these measures of memory, we see that we do much, much better, right? Where we no longer, and this is what I mean by traditional measures, really sometimes dramatically underestimate the value and of a brand. And in this case, McDonald's brand equity is being tremendously underestimated. And with Nike is also underestimated. But you can see that in some ways that the strong position of Nike in this category is in fact masking some of the value of being top of mind. Okay. And the reason is, so some of you are Nike fans, but so this is just thought experiments. Imagine Nike suddenly decides to make terrible shoes, right? They will probably still be able to coast for a couple years based purely on their being top of mind. And then it's all going to come crashing down when they start losing both of those, right? So this is, I think, probably one of the most interesting lessons, I think, for marketers in terms of the different timescales of memory and preference. Typically, our preferences change much quicker than our memory, right? Like McDonald's, well, I shouldn't be too negative about McDonald's. At one point, McDonald's was a very strong category leader. It no longer is, right? But it is still top of mind as in fast food restaurant or fast food category. Okay, so let me wrap up because I would love to hear your questions. In terms of conclusions, we provide a scientific foundation for kind of this commonsensical notion of top of mind that I think all of us understand intuitively, but it is hard to quantify it and put numbers on it. And we show that the traditional measures of brand equity really underestimate the value of top of mind. In the future directions, and this is a lot of things that's ongoing right now. One is how to automate, so using different techniques, including natural language processing and including scanning to automate these so that we don't have to do surveys every time we want to figure out what people remember. And also to measure, I think this is the big challenge in the future, to measure dynamic changes, how to influence people's memory and understand how to, the different time scales, as I mentioned earlier, of the effects on consumer behavior, and also beyond just consumer behavior in terms of other areas as well. So that is it for my presentation. Hopefully you got a sense of some of what we're working on. And this is, again, the team that it was instrumental in making this happen. and also the Neuroeconomics Lab, and also funding agencies who are very generous in funding at least some parts of this research. So, and with that, I would love to open them to questions.
Thank you, Ming. So I'm going to switch over to the questions now. So I'll turn it back to the audience. Thank you for those who already wrote in to the chat. If more questions come up, please add those and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. So Ming, the first question is, with so much competition for attention of consumers, what are some of the most innovative marketing methods you've seen in the last few years to get top of mind?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so I think a lot of the, and I think young people would actually probably know this much better than I will. A lot of the hardest aspects to get people's with the constraining of attention, or with the competition for attention, interactivity and engagement has become one of the most sought after and the hardest aspect for marketers to obtain from consumers. And we all know, and there's plenty of research to show that people learn best when they are engaged and when they're not just like listening to a lecture passively, but like exactly as you guys are doing, asking questions and being engaged. And a lot of you can kind of see this with a lot of the marketing campaigns in terms of I think particularly on social media, as ways to get people to talk about and engage in conversations. Now, that is also potentially quite dangerous, right? Because anytime you have a conversation, you risk also losing the conversation. But I think, yeah, especially because of the limited attention span that I think all of us have these days, being able to, having people to remember your advertising campaigns and your products becomes particularly challenging, and getting user engagement is probably the most effective way at achieving that.
Great, thanks, Ming. So we have another question that came through. Can you share more about how you see the role of AI/machine learning influence? Can you share more about how the role of AI and machine learning and how it influences your model, if at all?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So so I touched on that briefly at the end, which is probably too short for most people to notice even. But you can think of this as some of what we're doing as also showing both what AI and what standard models, including AI, is missing. So a lot of the mistakes that people make. So just take the example of kind of chess or Go, where basically AIs are wiping the floor with humans these days, right? So on the one hand, AI machines are performing better, but on the other hand, oftentimes they are not performing this task in a very human-like manner, right? They don't make mistakes in a human-like manner. So when we're thinking about serving consumers who are ultimately humans, we need to understand their mistakes as much as what they're good at, and also their strength and their weaknesses. And I think what we are hoping to do is also putting in kind of the human aspects of behavior back into the machines, so that we can serve humans better. So for example, one of the things that I think all of you are, at least I find annoying, is when an ad sort of follows me around, right? Like, yes, I've seen you, like, I don't want to see this anymore, but it's kind of keeping around, in part because it doesn't understand that I'm actually probably less likely to buy a brand if I see them all the time than, if after a certain number of points, right? So those type of mistakes have implications for both how we develop models and how we can kind of increase, consumer satisfaction. Yeah, so I think the sort of the general picture is we want machines that are not just kind of perfect. We also want them to be imperfect, but in a human way.
Great, thanks, Ming. Yes, we had a few more that came through. So does the model work for non-consumer products like Amazon Web Services, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have not done that. We have not done those studies, but certainly services and, if I ask you the top, what search engines come to mind, right? Like we think that it will be, it will translate, but we haven't done services yet. And in part because typically kind of in like Amazon Web Services, there just aren't that many competitors. So you go through one or two. So it's not as hard of a problem in some sense when it comes to the memory aspect. But to the extent where, in B2B areas where there are a lot of competitors, we certainly think that it will translate. Yeah, that's a great question.
Great, thank you. Another question that came through is, with like you mentioned, the fast food companies. I mean, how has their marketing and brand strategy changed with COVID? I mean, for example, when I go on the delivery apps, McDonald's always this is the top recommended. I never eat at McDonald's. I was kind of curious, how they've shifted how they approach consumers in today's world.
Yeah, that's so that is, I think, yeah, something that is on probably the minds of every chief marketing officer. I must admit, it is so new that anything I say will probably be as good as anything you can think of because this is so new to everyone. Yeah, I mean, I love to hear about your thoughts, but it's not so. I don't think it's something that I would have any particularly useful insights on. I apologize.
Yeah, thanks, Ming. Okay, so I think we have one final question that came through in the chat. Can you elaborate more on how we use these metrics for sustainability and how making sustainable choices is top of mind?
Yeah, I think this is something that I would love to, and particularly at Berkeley, I would love to touch on more. And in part is, I'm teaching an undergrad marketing, the undergrad core marketing class, and we actually had this very exact conversation about when companies and when consumers also think about sustainability, they tend to take a very product-centric take on sustainability. It's mostly about what materials can I create, what fish I eat. It tends to be very sort of focused on kind of the tangible aspects. And this is, I think, a really good reminder that one of the hardest, some of the hardest challenges for sustainability are actually in the they're not invisible, but they are so common and simple as being invisible. So for example, anytime I, compost something, I have to think about like, is this something that's compostable? Let me tell you that, I just caught myself. It's like something that I've been composting for the past, probably, I don't know, how long I've been composting, I just found out is wrong, right? So I've literally ruined, I don't know how many compost piles, right? And oh, I feel terrible now. But on the other hand, as consumers, is it really our fault if it is so hard to compost? Sure, some of it is our fault, right? So there's a lot of blame that goes around. And one of the challenges is, are we asking too much of consumers? How can we make it easier for them? And that goes back to the attention, that goes back to the memory, that goes back also to developing habits, right? So all of these things are literally in the mind of every single one of us. But without paying attention to that, if we just say like, oh, here's a magical new product, why don't you use it? Well, we're not going to get nearly as far than if we started paying attention to, again, how people actually behave and all the mistakes that humans make, kind of the human imperfection, and try to address those, right? Rather than just finding, here's a product that will be kind of magic bullet, right? And that's speaking of COVID, that is probably the biggest discussion now in public health, in marketing as well, that it's just put on a mask, right? How hard is that? Well, it is very hard for lots of different reasons. So thanks.
Thanks, Ming. So actually, a couple more questions came through, and I think we still have time, so we'll keep for a little bit longer. What other partnerships across the UC Berkeley community would you like to explore with your research? And how is this also related to ethics of companies tracking personal data, for example?
Yeah, that is, I'm really glad that you brought up. Okay, so the first question first, in terms of the different areas within and the different research center within Berkeley. I think one of the great things about Berkeley is, hopefully with this talk, I will also be able to make, not just people outside of Berkeley and alums, but also, within Berkeley, because there's so many, resources and excellent researchers that I don't know all of them. I would love to, a lot of the things with AI, with neuroscience, right? Like there's a lot of interesting new connections that can be brought up. And the one that I think, the one that we're actively kind of pursuing in terms of connecting is, it is on something that one of the earlier questions touched on with respect to AI and how to kind of scale up with our models so that we can not just do this kind of in about our contemporary society, but also go back in history and look at what was top of mind 100 years ago, right? What was top of mind 1,000 years ago? And one of the most fun conversations I had was with some members of my research group when we think about like what were some of the aspirational goods or aspirational consumption over the course of human history. And if you think about Jane Austen, right, like the whole book, right, whole books are about what do we aspire to, and those things really move human history, right? Like spices, right, the spice trade, right, the sugar trade, Silk Road, right? All those things are everyday consumer goods, right? And yeah, and so and coming back to the second one, with respect to let's see. Actually, remind me of the question again. I thought is I think just to make sure that I didn't misremember it. Speaking of memory constraints.
Yeah, this was related to a lot of the personal tracking of data.
Right. The ethics. Yes. So yeah, so I think this is something that we have not touched on, and I think it's something that is definitely on our agenda. And just like with marketers underestimating brand equity, you can also think about all the other aspect of consumer welfare that is being underestimated using our current models, right? So one example, and this is a little bit less to do with the brand equity projects that we're working on, but more with some other set of projects that we're working on related to hate speech. What is the cost of hate speech, right? When somebody sends a vile message on Twitter, right? How much damage does it cause to society, to a particular person? If you are literally thinking about this in dollars and cents, you will come up with, I think all of us would consider, a incredibly callous price of zero. So clearly it's not zero. And if you ask people, how much would you pay to not have to see this message? They might give you a price, but I can guarantee you it is underestimating the price of those those messages. So being able to better understand kind of the consumer's mindset, or in this case, not just consumer mindset, kind of the average person's mindset, I think that's a lot of the conversation about ethics, about certainly about advertising, they tend to be incredibly emotional, and I think for a good reason. And it is because we don't have very good metrics that captures our concerns, right? So it tends to be emotional because we don't have facts, and when you don't have facts, it just everyone sort of you get in this kind of vicious cycle where I don't think you're understanding me, and you don't, and you don't think that I'm understanding you, et cetera, et cetera. So in the same way that marketers can benefit from having better, and consumers can benefit for having better metrics of their mindset, of the consumer's mindset, I think the same thing in ethics and in online privacy, where we need to take more seriously the all the like not just attention, not just memory, but emotions, right? Like and also well-being, stress that we are being in terms of the ways that we're being affected, right? Not just in terms of clicks, not just in terms of purchases or what Twitter and Facebook probably are tracking most. I mean, I'm sure they're doing a lot more, but for the most part, what they have available is how often you use their service and how much, how happy or unhappy in the way that you're expressing them, right? Those are great, but they're better than nothing, but they're clearly not capturing all of the nuances of our experiences, and particularly with the concerns of online privacy and ethics related to that. Yeah.
Great. So we have two final questions. The first one is from Warden. Thank you, Warden. So does top of mind work in political elections where there's only two choices, Biden versus Trump as an example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that is, so I think there it helps to zoom out a little bit. The two candidate model is something that's kind of come about from, millennia of sort of evolution. Right? And even within the US, the final election is two, and I think it's a very, at least durable system, in part because when you have two, you don't have to worry as much about attention, as much about memory, right? Like top of mind, etc. But now let's kind of just take one step back with the primaries, and let's go 4 years. I would probably none of you want to go back 4 years, although maybe it's given it's particularly apt right now. 4 years ago, there were, I forget exactly how many, 16 Republican candidates, right, for the Republican nomination. And it was, I don't know, I never met anyone who can name all of them, right? And that's something where people, even at that time, has talked about Donald Trump had a huge advantage just by means of being notorious, right? No matter if you like him or you dislike him, everyone knows him. And this is something that political scientists have also, talked about and studied for a long time. And in many ways, they're ahead of marketers and economists in capturing this. But I think it's the same challenge where how do you translate that top of mind into vote shares on a more quantitative basis. But I think it's not so surprising that one of the reasons why Trump won the nomination was because of this huge field of candidates, and then he stood out in a very salient manner. And I mean, certainly you probably read as much of the aftermath and dissection of the election as I did. If there were only 2-3 candidates to begin with, maybe he wouldn't have. Maybe it would have been a very different type of competition, and very certainly different type of and potentially different outcome, right? So even in political elections, and you can sort of think of as, and I think restaurant it's actually not so different from the example of restaurants I gave earlier. There's a lot of role in norms and in rules in crafting the choice set to present to consumers so that they're able to deliberate and choose in a more careful and rational manner, right? And I think that's something that is, for the most part, again, it ends up being very political, and that reflects the fact that we don't have very sort of scientifically sound principles to be talking about, what is lost when we give people 20 candidates, right? Or what is gained. Yeah.
Thanks, Ming. Okay, so we have our last question. So one strong brand that comes to mind is Tesla. However, they're known for their lack of marketing, really relying on their brand for marketing. So with the model based on memory, would it be possible for a new entry to spend lavishly on marketing with an inferior product to dethrone Tesla in the electric vehicle market?
Yeah, that's I'm glad we ended on this. It sort of comes back to, I think, the core market implications of our ideas. And in this case, because, so let's think about Nike and and the difference between Nike and McDonald's. So Tesla is, as far as I know, is very top of mind and also very high in quality, right? So this is kind of the, you want to be in that position. And even if another brand spends lavishly, as long as Tesla doesn't become kind of a niche brand, and you don't need to, you don't need to necessarily advertise to be top of mind. There are plenty of companies that achieve top of mind status without, spending huge amounts on advertising. But as long as Tesla, you can think of as remains in the consideration set that consumers have. If it gets forgotten, if it gets really low, that's bad. But as long as it's remembered, right, it will always beat whatever this fictitious other brand is when you bring them up together, right? It's sort of, you can think of as like, whenever I remember In-N-Out and McDonald's, I always choose In-N-Out, right? But when I forget about In-N-Out, then I go to McDonald's. So as long as Tesla doesn't drop out, it can still achieve a very high market share, right? And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of kind of the interaction between those two forces in terms of quality or preference and top of mind as being synergistic. And one can, in some cases, mask weaknesses in the other, right? And that, I think, is one of those things where it's going to differ for every single market, right? And but that's, I see that as a strength, in part because every market is different, right? Like competitive structure within a market has a lot of implications for how companies should compete, position, and make alliances. Yeah. So yeah, and if well, thanks for all your questions. This was this was fantastic.
Thank you again, Ming, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We really appreciate your research and you spending the time with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for joining us today for our Berkeley Haas Homecoming Lectures. And that's it. So go Bears.
Yeah, go Bears.